Hello and welcome to episode 31 of Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, the podcast dedicated to reviewing all the so-called Walt Disney animated classics in chronological order and reviewing them on their own merits in a modern context, to decide whether they're worthy of going on our own refined list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. My name's Ben, and joining me as always is my good friend Liam. Liam, which film are we looking at this week?
I hope you all enjoy overbearing religious imagery, because this week we are taking a look at 1996's adaptation of Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Often considered one of the looser adaptations in the Disney catalogue, but I mean, they're all fairly loose adaptations, so when people criticise this film for that, I think it's a little bit bad faith, but I get what they're saying. Because, yeah, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is not exactly the type of novel you would expect to be adapted for a family film. So Ben, before we jump into this, what is your history with this film?
So, The Lion King is the last of the Disney animated classics that I grew up with watching as a child. So even though Hunchback and Pocahontas and some of the other ones we've got coming up, like Hercules and Mulan, even though they came out when I was the prime age to be watching Disney films, I didn't watch any of them until I was an adult. But I think in the very specific case of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, that's probably for the best, because this really isn't a children's film. How about you?
I think I'm in a similar position. Despite going to the cinema to watch Aladdin and the Lion King when I was very, very young, for some weird reason my parents didn't take me to the cinema for pretty much the rest of the Disney Renaissance. I mean, they took me to the cinema, but they didn't take me to watch these films.
You've had your fill of cinema. We're never going again.
Now you're a boy of 5. You must find your own way to fill the time. I think I saw this at some point, maybe when I was around 10, and I didn't really watch it very attentively. I didn't like it. I think the main reason I didn't like it is because I was disturbed by the ugly main character, which, I mean, kind of missing the point of the film there, but young Liam was not the best person in the world as it was, so I think the theming went completely over his head.
I didn't mention this in our Beauty and the Beast podcast, but someone I know who saw Beauty and the Beast at the cinema when it came out, they said when Beast dies, spoiler warning, there were some other girls in the cinema and they were inconsolable to the point where their parents took them out of the screening. So as far as they're concerned, that's how the film ends.
I still want the correct ending of the spell breaking but him still being dead.
But there'll be plenty of time for comparisons to Beauty and the Beast later on, so let's launch into the plot of The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
So for context, I've been watching all of these on Disney Plus, and right at the start, a notification came up saying that it contained tobacco depictions. And I was thinking, I don't remember any tobacco in this film. Who smokes? And oh, it's the goat. So I like that they warned me about that.
That's fantastic. I like that this film contains some scenes of tobacco smoking and intended genocide.
It's interesting because it didn't have the warning that we've seen regarding cultural depictions, and we'll get to this in a bit, but I think it's because there's no real negative depictions of people here. There is obviously the use of the term gypsy, though it's often not used by the Romani people themselves. So I think with a sort of modern eye, you can sort of forgive it that the characters are using a slur because they are characters who would use a slur. But yeah, no warnings about that, just warnings about a smoking goat, which I enjoyed.
And to be fair, this film is set in the 15th century, so I suppose there's a case to say that we'd expect a certain level of that language, much in the same way in Pocahontas they repeatedly use the term savages, where I think we can understand as a modern audience that that term is being used in a derogatory way. So this film opens with Clopin, who is a very weird character in this film, but he's a puppeteer, or at least he is sometimes, and he's telling the story of how Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, came to be in the bell tower. And this is done through the flashback sequence and the song The Bells of Notre Dame.
What a great story to tell to children via a street performance with puppets. There's something very odd about Clopin, where I never quite know how I feel about him, because in ways he's quite a sinister character. But this opening, it's just a very dark story to be telling children. And I'm not sure, is he telling the whole story, is he the narrator for the film? Because I think he closes out the film as well. So I assume he's telling this whole story to the children via puppets.
Which means there's at points of his story where he says, and by the way, I was a massive dick at this point. This story then is about Claude Frollo, who is a judge in Notre Dame, and he has a passionate hatred of Romanis, or as he normally refers to them as gypsies. And this specific story is about some trying to sneak their way either in or out of Paris, I can't remember, and one of them running away when Frollo is seizing everything from them, and he runs after them assuming they've got some stolen goods. One of the guards has what I can only describe as Jim Cummings' gruff guard voice, because it's the same voice as Razul and several other gruff characters he voices, and I was like, oh, it's Jim Cummings, he's along for the ride.
So many of the background characters seem to be voiced by Jim Cummings. I think Corey Burton is one of the guards as well, but for the most part, if a background character is talking, it's pretty much a coin toss as to whether it's Jim Cummings or not.
So Frollo chases after this woman. Now Wikipedia describes him as accidentally killing her. I think that's a bit generous. He runs her down with his horse, she falls and cracks a skull on the stairs of Notre Dame and dies.
It's at this point that Frollo seizes what he assumes were the stolen goods, notices that it is in fact a baby, deformed baby, by some unseen measure at this point, and decides that this baby is an abomination and must be killed, and goes to drown it in a well. So, great opening for our Disney movie right here.
There's a couple of things about this. One, Frollo clearly gets his horse from the same stables as Gaston, because it looks like the most evil horse imaginable.
This horse seems to have been summoned directly from hell itself, and I kind of love it.
Frollo must have done the Dark Brotherhood side quests in this continuity.
His horse also has great hair, which I really enjoy. I don't know why, it just stands out as an element of that horse's character. Just big, evil looking, and has great hair.
I think we get a very immediate insight into Frollo as a character, because when he sees that the baby is deformed, his first thought is, he looks either side to him and goes, what's the quickest way I can kill a baby? Oh, the well, perfect. And he goes over there with all the nonchalance of someone sending a postcard through a letterbox. It's just, I'll just go and put this in here and get on with my day.
Luckily, however, he is stopped by the Archdeacon, voiced by our fave David Ogden Stiers. Once again, another great performance from him, who condemns Frollo's actions so far and basically says if he goes any further, he's basically going to hell. And so we're told Frollo, for the first time in his life, experiences not even guilt, it's described, I think, as fear for his immortal soul, and asks the Archdeacon what he should do, and the Archdeacon says, you have to raise the child as your own. Frollo agrees, but on the condition that actually the Archdeacon raises him.
Yeah, I don't know why the Archdeacon puts up with that. Frollo's like, alright, I'll do it, but he lives here. I'm like, well, that's not really how it works, is it, Frollo? And then the sequence ends by showing that Quasimodo, as Frollo names him, is now grown up, and he lives as the bell ringer in the towers of Notre Dame.
I love this introduction. I think it's really solid. The only sort of very mild criticism I have about it is Clopin poses the question very early, who is the monster and who is the man? Or I think maybe what makes a monster and what makes a man? But it's very clear to the audience that he is implying Frollo is the monster straight out the gate, which I'm fine with, but I feel you don't need to sell that to the audience as hard as he does. Compare this to, say, the opening of Beauty and the Beast. The introduction ends on just that question for who could ever love a beast. And yes, it cuts to Belle, but that is a lot subtler than Clopin looking at the audience and basically winking and pointing at Frollo going, he's the monster.
I assume this is an instance where someone at some point has looked at this film and gone, how are children supposed to watch this? And I think having Clopin just tell them what the point of the story is was probably one of those concessions. This also leads into probably the main concession we get, which is we're introduced to Quasimodo and he's ringing the bells, and we're also introduced to his 3 friends, Victor, Hugo, and Laverne, the gargoyles.
Shall we just get the gargoyles out of the way with just completely then?
This film certainly does that, so yeah.
I don't mind the gargoyles. I just think they overstep in a few places during the film. Jason Alexander in particular oversteps quite a few times. So I really like the idea of, in Quasimodo's isolation, he made friends with the gargoyles, and it's suggested at several points throughout the film that they are just a figment of his imagination, and it is part of his insanity that has created these. And I really like that, and I think when that works, the gargoyles work. The problem is there are several other points during the film where the gargoyles interact outside of Quasimodo, and it suggests that actually they are just hiding from the rest of the world and they have revealed themselves to Quasimodo. And whenever that's the case, I basically just want to cut every instance of that from the film.
I definitely agree with that sentiment, and I think I prefer the idea that they are in his head and he's given these gargoyles personalities to keep himself company, which is heartbreakingly sad, but that is what this film's MO is. I always think I dislike the gargoyles more than I do, and I actually think they've got some good lines and some genuinely funny bits. They've got a little song which I think is quite fun. I actually think that the gargoyles themselves, in terms of what their function is, I think is a great idea. I think they're let down by not being characterised amazingly well. I couldn't really tell you what the point of them is, other than being something more lighthearted and giving Quasimodo someone to talk to, which is important in terms of narrative and character development. But yeah, they're not Lumiere and Cogsworth, I'll put it that way.
I have discussed the gargoyles at length with a friend of ours way too many times, and generally the conclusion I've come to is when the gargoyles serve the purpose of basically being Quasimodo's inner voice, almost like, you know, the typical angel and devil on someone's shoulders. When the gargoyles fill those purposes, like there's a moment before the Festival of Fools where they're trying to convince him to go to the Festival of Fools, and if you read that scene as he's trying to convince himself, it works, and that's where the different personalities of the gargoyles come out. There's one who is a lot more gung-ho and wants to just go for it. There's one that's a lot more cautious, and Laverne is much more of the sort of heart of Quasimodo. And there's times where that works really well, and you can see you've got Quasimodo has projected his own excited, impetuous, and reckless side onto one of these. There's the reasoned, slightly fearful side there that can sort of reassure him when he thinks he's being too reckless. And then finally, there is just that core, deep down, what do I really want? And they work really well. And I think if they'd leaned more into that with the characterization, it would work really well. The problem is these characters are created in the shadow of the genie, which is something we're going to start seeing a lot more of towards the tail end of the Renaissance, where they're weird sort of comedic characters that are there more for the audience than the film, because the creators, for some weird reason, don't seem to understand what worked and what was so great about Robin Williams' Genie.
I think they probably did, but they also looked at this film and went, if we don't have the gargoyles, there's nothing in here for kids. Let's move forward then. So we see Quasimodo in his tower. Frollo comes and ostensibly is looking after him, but is just being horrible to him, as per. We see Quasimodo makes little models of the people he sees down in the town, and I just wrote, and that's how Warhammer was first designed.
Are you assuming that's what he uses this little table setup for?
I'm exactly suggesting that. So later on when Esmeralda comments on how talented he is, I then expect him to say, well, these are ranged units, so they can't... And as you say, the gargoyles convince Quasimodo to go to the Festival of Fools. They say to make sure he's got a clean pair of hose, raise his eyebrows.
I really like this sequence, particularly the part where Frollo shows up. So again, as you said, he's decided he's going to go to the Festival of Fools. As he's leaving, Frollo shows up for his occasional visit to his adopted son in a different house. And one thing I really enjoy about this film is how much it kind of hits you across the head with the imagery. So when Frollo sits down for lunch with Quasimodo brings out their tableware, and Quasimodo's is this rubbish wooden plate and wooden goblet, and Frollo has a nice, I think potentially even silver goblet and plate, where he is just abusive and treats Quasimodo like he deserves to be locked away, which is exactly what he's done. They even have this scene where they're reviewing the ABCs and all of the letters are just horrifying and to do with like overt Catholic guilt, which I really enjoy.
This is arguably Frollo at his nicest in this film.
I mean, you say that, but when Quasimodo slips up and his F is festival, and Frollo realises he was thinking of going to the festival, he basically sings a song where he tells Quasimodo that he's a monster, and if he were to ever leave the bell tower, everyone would reject and hate him, which leads us to our first of not one, not two, but 3 I Want songs in this film, which I think is excellent.
This is certainly the most wholesome of them.
I think the second one's pretty wholesome. Unless you're thinking that the third I Want song is Clopan talking about wanting to kill people. Maybe there's 4.
People want a lot of things in this film. So we're talking about the song Out There, which is a very simple I Want song. I think it does a really good job of endearing the character of Quasimodo to the audience, because what he wants is so simple. So Ariel wants to be part of another species, Belle wants this life of adventure, Aladdin wants to be pulled out of poverty and live the high life. All Quasimodo wants to do is literally go outside and meet people. He's really not asking for much, and I think it's as sweet as it is heartbreaking.
This is probably the most Alan Menken song that Alan Menken has ever written. If I ever need to introduce people to his particular style with these soaring elements, this is the one I go to. I love this song. I really like as well that they're letting Tom Hulce sing it himself, which we've not seen in a few recent films. And he's not the greatest singer, but there is an endearing quality to his voice that frankly comes across in just the normal voice performance anyway. But by having the same actor, you can have the same performance in the singing part as well. And this song does just make you fall in love with Quasimodo, and just you really are rooting for him after this point. It's the perfect I Want song.
Now, I don't know how you feel about the songs in this film, Liam. My feeling is that I don't think these are amazingly catchy songs. They're not songs that I kind of sing along to myself or get stuck in my head. But I also think they are superb at driving story and character, and the epic scale of them is really impactful. They make me think of a full-blown West End / Broadway musical. I mean, the comparison point I always end up making is Les Miserables, which obviously is also an adaptation of a Victor Hugo novel. I don't know whether that was deliberate inspiration for this, but yeah, that's my feeling with these songs. They're not the ones that I'd want to hear on a best of Disney CD, but I think in the context of the film when they appear, they are very powerful.
No, I think you're right. This is probably the most Broadway-esque of the Disney films. I think the songs are consistent throughout and serve the purpose they're supposed to serve. So I mentioned this is Alan Menken, but again, like Pocahontas, this is Stephen Schwartz doing the lyrics. And I do think this is much better than Pocahontas in that regard. But yeah, there's definitely that Broadway influence. As I say, like right the way through the film, the songs that are still happening still feel appropriate. But alongside the actual music, some of the visuals in this sequence are wonderful. We've got this beautiful shot of Quasimodo running between the columns above Notre Dame, which every time I see it is absolutely gorgeous. In fact, on a related note, if you've ever seen the posters for the Renaissance films, there is often a version of the posters from the original release which is very simplistic and often in silhouette. And I think this one, the one for Hunchback of Notre Dame, is probably my favourite, which is just a silhouetted Quasimodo in front of a huge stained glass window, and it's just gorgeous. One of these days, I'm going to get all of the Renaissance posters, and line my living room with them, which, if that doesn't tell you that this man's insane. He collects posters.
We are also introduced around this point to our other main characters. So we get the character of Phoebus, who is a soldier who has returned to Paris recently. He mentions that he's been away for a couple of decades, which I was thinking, how long has Phoebus been in the military? Either he's way older than he looks, or he joined when he was about 12.
I guess it's one of those weird time frames where they had to do that because of Frollo's reign. Quasimodo at this point is 20, so maybe that's where they've got the 2 decades from. And from the introductory sequence, I got the impression that Frollo had been in this position for some time, maybe. So yeah, I'm confused. I think they were trying to get away with Phoebus not being familiar with Frollo, but I don't really think that's super important. I think he can just know him and maybe just not know him well enough to know that he is a monster.
How do you feel about the character of Phoebus overall?
I actually do quite like Phoebus, but he does need to shut up occasionally.
I really can't decide. I think, obviously, morally, he's a good character, and I think he does have a really solid arc. He's arguably the 4th most important character in this film, so the fact he gets a clear arc is really good. I genuinely can't decide if he's charming or just a dick. I suspect a bit of both.
I can definitely see that. I really like his role within the film. It's not just his arc, but he is involved in a lot of major scenes, which, as you say, this is the 4th main character. For them to be juggling that many elements and all of them to still be relevant is quite impressive, and I do like the character of Frollo. I just think some of the dialogue, maybe tone it down a bit. I think this is what you're referring to, where they need some levity to keep the kids engaged, and I think a lot of that levity is sometimes misjudged.
I also overlooked that we have relatively famous actors here. Kevin Kline is the voice of Phoebus, and Demi Moore is the voice of Esmeralda. Now, Esmeralda is awesome, and we get some exploits of her and Phoebus teaming up, and sort of Phoebus helps her outrun the guards, and we also see that Phoebus is now the captain of the guard under Frollo.
Is the indicator that Phoebus is the captain of the guards the fact that he's wearing what seems to be solid gold armour? Because that seems like a really expensive badge of honour.
Also, gold's not even that good as armour. It's fine, I'm not knocking it, but also I like that we never get a reference to what war Phoebus has been at, and he just returns by himself, so I can only assume it's been a one-man war against some unseen foe, a dragon or something.
It's his war against addiction. After this introduction, then, we cut to the Festival of Fools, and we see that Quasimodo has left his tower and has joined the festival, albeit very cautiously. He's keeping his hood up and trying to hide his face. We get a nice jaunty number from Clopin. However, alongside this, there's something very sinister about this scene where Clopin is stalking Quasimodo for some reason, and I'm wondering, how much does he know? Because there's indication in this film that people are aware of the bell ringer. And I don't know, does Clopin see Quasimodo and it's like, that's the bell ringer, I'm going to get him involved? Or is he just being mean because there is an apparently very shy person trying not to get involved, and it's like, well, you've signed your own death warrant there, I'm going aggressively after you?
I think he'd have made an excellent pantomime dame in that regard. Quasimodo also bumps into Esmeralda briefly, and she doesn't respond in any way to his face, which he's surprised by. She does comment that he's got a great mask, though, thinking he's dressed that way for what they call Topsy-Turvy Day in the song. I guess it's a riff on Carnivale, sort of medieval practice of the top being at the bottom and the bottom being at the top. And as one of the main events, Esmeralda comes out and dances in front of the crowd, including the guest of honour, Judge Frollo.
Now, one animator in particular was way too into the material of Esmeralda's outfit, because I don't think I've ever seen a satin or silky material animated in a way that is as convincing.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think more generally, this sequence does such a good job of establishing Esmeralda's sexuality, but I don't think that is being done for the male gaze necessarily. I think in the context of this film, we establish that Esmeralda dances because that's what she's good at and that's how she makes money. But I don't think as an audience, Esmeralda's being portrayed in that way. I think a lot of it is about the strength and the confidence she gets from that, and how she's not defined by her sexuality, but she's defined by her politics and her ethics, and that is just a part of herself that she uses in that. You may well disagree.
That's a really good point that I hadn't considered, because in regards to the male gaze, I've always thought of it as, alongside this, we're seeing the reaction of the literal male gaze within the film, i.e. how all the men are reacting to her. But you're right, as an audience, we see so much more of her character, and I think we get this sort of sexualized introduction, but then as an audience, we are let in more. Like, we see the brief moment before the dance number where she's interacting with Quasimodo and she's very kind. We see the moment afterwards, which we'll get to. And then she's not really sexualized again from an audience perspective, but we then get the male characters, particularly Frollo, who this is really all he sees and all he knows about Esmeralda. And he never moves on. So although we're seeing his sort of very leery approach to her, as an audience, we do get to see a lot more. I hadn't really considered that.
I guess my comparison point would be characters like Jasmine or Megara in Hercules, where, don't get me wrong, I like both those characters and I think there are some good aspects of their writing, but I think their sexuality doesn't really serve any purpose in the film other than let's have this character also be sexy, whereas I think Esmeralda does have that. That said, I'm very conscious we're two men in their 30s, so maybe we're not the best people to make a call as to whether a female character is being over-sexualized or not.
But after her dance number, we cut to the crowning of the King of Fools, in which Clopin brings various people up to the stage and they're asked to make the ugliest face they can as their masks are pulled off, and the crowd will deem them whether they are the ugliest face in Paris and can be deemed the King of Fools. And it's at this point that Esmeralda goes to pull off Quasimodo's mask, only to realise that that's not a mask and it is actually his face. And I really like how the scene changes. The musical number itself has been going on throughout all of this, including the dance sequence, and then it's just at this point that it immediately stops and we cut to the reaction of the crowd, and it is just this very sudden moment. One thing I really enjoy as well is when I was watching this, I was thinking, how does Frollo not realise that's Quasimodo on the stage until the last moment? Watching it this time, I realised that someone in the crowd says, "It's the bell ringer," and it then cuts to Frollo, who is looking up, and it's just, obviously he had no interest in what was going on and was just doing something else, which I really enjoy.
I think there's also a case to say that he's so conflicted by how he feels about Esmeralda, it's kind of messed with his head. Now, this crowd turns on a goddamn dime a few times during this sequence. So as you say, at first it's quite cheery, and then they're shocked and horrified that that's Quasimodo's real face, but Clopin kind of brings them back round and says, we wanted to find the ugliest face in Paris and we found it, and he crowns him and everyone's happy, and then some of the guards start throwing vegetables at him, and then the whole crowd is like, yeah, let's just literally tie him up, spin him round on a wheel and throw things at him for as long as possible. Like, if there's one thing the Disney Renaissance has taught me, is the majority of people in France are dicks.
I think it's more that they're easily swayed. Clopin can sway them to good, and a single guard throwing a tomato can turn them to evil. Again, I really like how this scene is framed. We have it timed with the sunset, so it suddenly becomes very red and sinister as this is happening, which I really enjoy.
Personally, I'm going to go so far as to say I find this sequence to be the most distressing sequence in all of the Disney animated classics. Not necessarily the most upsetting in terms of sort of emotional kick, but there's something about a character who's very pure and childlike and innocent being literally tortured by an entire mob for an extended period of time that's just horrifying.
What I really love about this sequence is all Quasimodo wanted was a single day out with people, and he's got it. He's got his single day, and Frollo was right. They hate him, and they've humiliated him. So he achieved the one thing he wanted, and it was awful. And it's at this point instead that we're now like, he deserves so much more than the very basic thing he wanted. And I just love that from a narrative perspective. To have a character with a very simple one, you give it to them, and it's not what they deserve. Like, they deserve so much more than that.
We do eventually get some more moral characters step up. Phoebus challenges Frollo on why he's letting this continue, and then Esmeralda stops the crowd. She frees Quasimodo and cleans him off, and then when Frollo challenges her on it, she calls him out on his tyranny, and then there's an extended chase sequence where she runs away from the guards, eventually fleeing into Notre Dame itself.
Alongside this, we also see Quasimodo humiliated, picking himself up and returning to the church himself with this wonderful overhead shot of the crowd just dispersed around him, and it's raining, obviously, and he just returns home completely defeated.
Frollo, of course, never being one to let things go, sends the guards into Notre Dame to seize her. Phoebus effectively gives Esmeralda sanctuary. Frollo goes to dismiss this, but then the Archdeacon says, Frollo learned years ago to respect the sanctity of the church. Did he, though? Did he? Because I don't feel like he did. And, in such a horrible sequence, the guards go out, Frollo hides behind a pillar, then jumps out and grabs Esmeralda by the neck. And there's just one specific, he sniffs her hair, and he says, I was just thinking how good a rope would look around that beautiful neck. And Esmeralda just snaps back with, I know what you were thinking. My God, it's creepy.
I really like that this is in the film. There's often arguments made by people saying that you need to keep certain things out of children's films because let children be children and have them keep their innocence. The problem is, and without going too dark, many girls will be sexualized from a very young age, and something like hair sniffing is something that people can experience without really knowing what's happening. And I'm not saying that this film will have led to conversations, but what I am saying is you can put these things into children's films and trust that it's okay to have villainous characters do horrible, and in this case, very real things that are quite threatening.
And I think real is the word I would use when looking at Frollo, because I think more than any other Disney villain, I believe that people like that exist in the real world. Don't get me wrong, Gaston has elements of that, but Frollo, he's not a you love to hate him kind of character. He's just irredeemable and evil and selfish and so obsessed with justifying his own actions. And this is a prime example where, by any objective gaze, we can see that what he's doing is wrong, but in his own head, he's convinced he's right and that he's doing the right thing in the world.
I think Frollo is done really well, and obviously the original novel is a criticism of corruption and hypocrisy within the church itself. I think changing Frollo to a judge is fine. I think it probably would have been a lot more difficult for them to make the film if they were to have Frollo be the archdeacon as he was in the original source. But despite that, Disney aren't going to stop short of criticising the church entirely, and we're greeted to a song that is basically criticising Christians in general, which I really enjoy, in the form of Esmeralda's God Help the Outcasts, though rather than being sung by Demi Moore, this instead is sung by Heidi Mollenhauer.
The link into this song is the Archdeacon comes up to Esmeralda and says, maybe you can find someone who can help in these four walls. And obviously there's a double meaning there. He's talking about God, but obviously in a narrative sense, we're talking about Quasimodo. I really wish he paused and then went, Steve over there is great with these sorts of things.
What if in continuing the theme, that was just his very clumsy way of flirting?
Ugh. As you say, they changed Frollo from working for the church to being a judge. But if they thought that sidestepped religious imagery in this film, it really doesn't. We'll talk about the song itself in a second, but it's during this number, I think, we really start to see the main visual motif in this film, and that is that of fire. It plays throughout the rest of the film in so many contexts. I think they do a superb job of animating it and using light and how that's cast, which, again, we're working with 2D animation here for the most part. I think it's incredible what they achieve with that. But also how fire portrays these different characters. So for Esmeralda in this sequence, it makes her look warm and lights her up and makes her stand out. And we'll talk about some other uses of fire later on. But this song itself is just heartbreaking.
I get quite emotional whenever this comes on, and I always seem to forget how much it gets to me until I'm actually listening to it in the film. Because as you say, it's not a song that I will remember or go out of my way to listen to, or it'll get stuck in my head. But hot damn if it doesn't perfectly nail what it's trying to do within the film.
Basically, the song is Esmeralda effectively praying and saying she wants all the outcast and downtrodden people of society, including the Romani people in Paris, to be looked after and be given a chance. And we hear all the other people they're praying for fame and fortune and all these selfish things, and Esmeralda doesn't want any of that. She says she's got enough to get by. I think it's just a really simple, beautiful sequence. And again, it's almost a subversion of the I Want song. It's that I don't want any of these things, but I do want other people to be treated fairly.
The imagery in this scene as well is absolutely fantastic. I think it is very much, as I say, there's moments in this film where they just kind of hit you over the head with it. And I enjoy that as everyone else is walking in one direction, Esmeralda's walking in the opposite direction. But as you say, it's just about wanting what's best for other people. In fact, it's not even really, I want these people to be looked after. It's just give them a break, show them some kind of mercy, because no one here is doing that.
Whilst Esmeralda's singing this, Quasimodo hears her and comes down and watches her. And eventually he starts talking to her, and they go to the bell tower, where Quasimodo enthusiastically shows her around and assures her he can help her escape from the cathedral and get past all the guards Frollo's posted around the outside.
Now, there's something weird about this scene, other than Jason Alexander being horny for a goat for some reason. But if you've ever watched the sequel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame 2...
I'll just say I haven't, and I never will.
That film revolves around, I believe, a circus coming to town, and the leader of the circus wants to steal one of the bells from Notre Dame, because one of these bells, despite looking fairly plain and ordinary on the outside, if you go under the bell, you can see that it's actually encrusted with gold and jewels. Therefore, it's worth a fortune. In one of the strangest and ham-fisted metaphors Disney's ever done. My question is, when Quasimodo is showing Esmeralda around, why doesn't he show her the bell that's encrusted with jewels?
Because the sequel isn't real. It's just nonsense. My question, Liam, is did this circus manager have a dog band?
No, but he did have a wig and a girdle to show that, despite the fact that he's very vain and attractive, actually it's all a front, and he's not actually attractive. And real beauty comes from the inside, like on a giant jewel-encrusted bell, or in his case, on the outside, because as well as being mean, he's also ugly too.
I don't have anything to say. Like, how do you follow Frollo as a villain? Well, we'll just do something terrible, I suppose. Whilst Quasimodo is sheltering Esmeralda, Phoebus shows up to try and help her. Quasimodo just sees him as a guard, and again he chases Phoebus out of the tower with fire, and again I think it's a really good example where they both look very dramatic and aggressive. Quasimodo looks quite monstrous here, and again it's the motif of fire and the different contexts in which that's used. And as night falls, Quasimodo climbs down the side of the cathedral carrying Esmeralda and her goat, and he helps them escape.
It's at this point that Esmeralda tells Quasimodo that because he helped her, if he ever needs help or he ever needs sanctuary, he can come to her, and she gives him a necklace and tells him that when you wear this woven band, you hold the city in your hand. And this might be the most filmy element of this film, where I don't understand how this system would work in real life. So basically, it's revealed to be a map at some point, but it's not a very detailed map. I feel like you could have just told people where the hideout is, and then maybe given them an indication of the symbol to look for.
And also maybe mention that, by the way, if you come, Clopan will try and hang you as soon as you arrive. They probably could have used a heads up on that.
Quasimodo then returns to the bell tower and is overwhelmed with the emotions he's feeling towards Esmeralda, but he can't quite put his finger on it, and he sings this lovely, just very brief song called Heaven's Light, which is all about his feelings of someone finally in his life showing him kindness, because there's a moment where Esmeralda basically challenges Quasimodo's views that were instilled by Frollo, and she makes him question maybe Frollo isn't always right and things he's told you could be wrong. And we just get this nice little number really hammering home that up until this point, no one has treated Quasimodo with any kind of kindness. Not even the Archdeacon, apparently, which, I mean, what's going on there?
Speaking of the Archdeacon, we see he's leading prayers and chanting and swinging incense, and that chanting forms the underlying theme that bleeds into what's going on over at the judge's lodgings, where we see Frollo ostensibly praying to the Virgin Mary in the form of the song Hellfire.
I really miss proper Disney villains with proper Disney villain songs. I don't want any of this nonsense they're doing these days with, the villain was society, or they're just kind of there, or it's a twist, they're secretly a villain all along. I want just an evil bastard singing a song about how much of an evil bastard he is.
For those who haven't seen this film, this is a really complex sequence. Visually, it's very simple. Frollo is stood in front of his fireplace, reflecting on what's happened that day and his experiences with Esmeralda, but there's a lot going on here. Effectively, Frollo is experiencing lust, and he's trying to reconcile that with his religious belief, or what he perceives as Christianity. So this starts with him uncontrollably picturing Esmeralda dancing. It leads to this huge abstract sequence of hooded religious figures judging him and him proclaiming that the devil is so much stronger than a man, and then resolving that the only solution is either Esmeralda has to burn or she has to be his. I mean, this is way more complicated than wanting to have a nice coat.
Yep, Frollo's great. I love this song. I think this might be my favourite villain song. It's fantastic. We've got, as you say, just that theme of fire, and in this case, particularly hellfire, and it's his fear that he's going to be condemned. Again, he's more concerned about the afterlife than his actions in this life. So we've now had our I Want song from our hero, and in this case, kind of I Want song from the villain. And what I love is that for both of these songs, their counterpart introduces the song with a short number that is the complete opposite. So for Out There, Frollo first sings that you have to stay in here because people will hate you. And for Hellfire, which is all about lusting after someone else, Quasimodo is singing a song about how nice it is to just have someone else be kind to you. And we've talked in previous episodes about how the best villains have this relationship and this connection to the hero. And in this case, I think there's this constant paralleling between Quasimodo and Frollo, which I think it's one of the best hero and villain relationships we've got in the Disney animated classics.
It's particularly sold by the strength of Tony Jay's performance here, which is really powerful. And my only other comment on Hellfire is that the thing I find incredibly disturbing about it is that this sequence starts with Frollo worrying that his feelings are wrong, and by the end of this song, he's convinced himself that he's right and that it's Esmeralda's fault that he feels this way. And again, I think there's so many parallels to people in real life where they convince themselves that their feelings of lust and a lack of reciprocation is the fault of the object of their desire, rather than their own internal fault. It's really powerful. I'm talking about men's rights activists.
I love overt religious imagery and really anything to do with giving the Catholic Church this sort of domineering presence. And one thing I really like is questioning what is sin. And in this case, we're dealing with one of the cardinal sins, in this case, lust. And you can ask, what is wrong with lust or feeling lustful? Why is that a sin? And it's nothing to do with how you are feeling, but it's about how it affects other people. And I love that Frollo is more concerned with the fact that he is feeling lust, therefore he is committing a sin. Whereas what makes it a sin is how he acts on that. But he doesn't care. He just is so overwhelmed with this Catholic guilt that he has to lash out and blame it on Esmeralda. It's that very attitude that leads to the sin itself. In this case, burning down half of Paris and almost killing someone.
And Frollo very much makes good on his threat to burn down Paris. We get a montage of him getting increasingly ruthless with hunting down what he calls the gypsies. Each time he imprisons a group of them, he offers to bribe them for details of where he can find Esmeralda, but they all refuse to talk. And this culminates in a trip to a miller's, where Frollo gets them to admit to harbouring gypsies. He says they're under house arrest until a full investigation's been carried out. He walks out, locks the door, and orders Phoebus to burn it down with the family still inside.
Of course, Phoebus refuses the order, essentially relinquishing his post, and is there sentenced to death, basically. Frollo takes the brand and burns the mill down himself, whilst his guards chase after Phoebus, who has escaped on Frollo's own horse. One thing I enjoy, I've just realised about the start of this whole sequence, is when Frollo first shows up, he's very tired, and Phoebus asks him if he's okay, and Frollo just responds that he had a bit of trouble with the fireplace, referring to the song Hellfire. But I'm thinking, what does that mean in a normal context? Like, if I show up one day and I'm completely exhausted, I'm like, oh, I had some trouble with the fireplace. What does that mean?
You know, you put the logs on, but they're not quite catching, and then there's a draft, so you have to, like, close the thing, and then you have to clean up the ashes. It's a whole rigmarole. That never happened to you?
Just go to bed.
It feels weirdly out of character for Frollo, because you just expect him to just respond with something along the lines of, why are you so tired? Oh, I was up all night killing gypsies. It's more believable.
So during this sequence, Phoebus is shot and falls into the river, presumably to his death.
My favourite Frollo line in this sequence is when Phoebus is riding away on Frollo's horse, he shouts, "Get him and don't hit my horse." It's not even played for laughs, it's Frollo just being a dick.
And of course, they do get him. They manage to shoot Phoebus, and he falls from the horse into the river. And Frollo orders the guards, tells them not to waste their arrows and to leave him to his watery grave, which is very much a Bond villain mentality. Like, if you want someone dead, like, really just make sure they're dead. Because Phoebus is rescued by Esmeralda, who needs to find sanctuary somewhere where he will be safe. Meanwhile, just as the action is picking up, and whilst all of Paris is burning, we jump to Quasimodo and the Gargoyles, and the Gargoyles decide to interrupt all of this action and sing a nice little song. It's weirdly timed is all.
It is. Again, as with a lot of stuff with the Gargoyles, they've gone, God, how do we bring this back to being watchable for children? We'll just have a fun little song. This is one of the instances where I kind of wish the Gargoyles were real and not just in Quasimodo's head. And the reason is, Quasimodo loves Esmeralda before this point in a, I'd say, mostly platonic way. He's clearly attracted to her, everyone in this film is. But the reason he's drawn to her is because she's shown him kindness. Whereas the Gargoyles kind of convince him that she's actually really into him and that it's more romantic, which kind of changes it. Whereas if those are an extension of Quasimodo, that means he's convinced himself that she's into him. Whereas if they're not, then it kind of maintains Quasimodo's innocence. So I have mixed feelings about this song. That said, this song does contain what I know you consider to be the best rhyme in all of Disney.
No, this isn't the best rhyming couplet in all of Disney. This is the best rhyming couplet in any musical ever.
And what is that couplet, Liam?
This is rhyming the word Adonis with the line, "And since you're shaped like a croissant is," and it's wonderful and convoluted, and I don't think Stephen Schwartz is ever going to beat it. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. That is a bit of a shame, actually, because I really like the idea that it is all just, projections of his own subconscious. And I suppose there'd be a case for his subconscious might be asking, oh, is it anything more than this? But you're right, I think it's much nicer if his only interest is platonic. And as we said, like, the thing he appreciates is that someone is being kind to him for the first time in his life. But for further evidence of it all being in his head, and the part that I really like and almost justifies this song's existence, is right at the end, he's interrupted by Esmeralda and we get this hard cut to reality where we see the musical sequence and then it cuts to what's presumably really happening, which I just think is wonderful and very, very sad.
Wonderful and very, very sad might be the best summary of this film. Esmeralda brings a very wounded Phoebus to Quasimodo to look after, which of course he willingly does for his friend, even though he doesn't particularly like Phoebus. Phoebus and Esmeralda have a quite intense moment together. They've had quite a lot of flirtatious moments back and forth throughout the film, and then they kiss. Quasimodo sees this and is just really deeply wounded, and I think one of the reasons this is so effective is he's not angry at either of them, he doesn't begrudge either of them it, he's just really, really hurt. He doesn't lash out or try and take Phoebus out of the picture, as certainly Frollo would do. It's just a really bittersweet moment.
What I think is really effective about this moment is, as he sees them kiss, he pulls out a little ace of hearts and just tears it up, which, if that's not the wonderful, subtle imagery akin to Simba stepping in Mufasa's footsteps, I don't know what is.
Well, if I can't be with Esmeralda, I guess I'm going to have to give up on my magic career as well.
Yeah, I like that he is more heartbroken than angry, but as you say, I kind of wish this whole element was just cut, and yeah, I could really do without the over-the-top imagery that they shoehorn in at the end there.
Esmeralda sneaks back out. Quasimodo is then visited by Frollo. He has to hide Phoebus, and Frollo's plan is to basically trick Quasimodo into finding the Court of Miracles for him. He says that he's going to storm it that night, and without a warning they're going to be in trouble, so Quasimodo and Phoebus escape, and using the aforementioned very filmic map that Esmeralda's given them, find their way to the Court of Miracles.
There's something here as well that I'm not 100% on, which is Quasimodo, after being chastised by Frollo, isn't sure he wants to go help Esmeralda, and I get the impression it's because he feels rejected by her, and it's just, again, it just is very awkward and doesn't really fit with the character, and I think if you just cut it, there's just this brief moment where he's not going to go with Phoebus, but Phoebus is going to go regardless, and Quasimodo realises that what's right is to join Phoebus, but you can just cut that and this works anyway. It's, I think, Quasimodo wanting to go and help these people because it's the right thing to do isn't a conclusion he has to reach. That is just who he is as a person. So yes, they get to the Court of Miracles in the catacombs of Paris and are ambushed by the people residing there and immediately gagged whilst Clopin sings a song about how he's going to execute them, which I love that he had this prepared.
My question was, the people who ambush them are dressed as skeletons to hide amongst the actual skeletons in the catacombs. How long do they lie there, waiting to get to do this? Because it can't happen all that often.
It shifts. Every night, it's your shift to go dress up as a skeleton and lie amongst the bones. I'm wondering how often they actually get intruders where that would be worth it, because I feel after, say, 4 weeks of having no intruders and dressed up as a skeleton, I'd just be like, you know what, let's just have normal guard posts.
No, we're gonna dress up as skeletons and lie in the sewage and bones for hours. As you say, Clopin is very quick to go to execute them as intruders. Esmeralda stops them, and almost immediately Frollo shows up and arrests everyone. Which leads us into the climax of the film, which happens the following day, where Frollo is threatening to burn Esmeralda at the stake in front of all her captured friends, as well as the general populace of Paris.
He presents her with the ultimatum from Hellfire, which is she can either be with him or she can burn, in this case quite literally, and obviously she refuses. She spits in his face and he lights the pyre below her. Meanwhile, up in the tower, Quasimodo has been restrained, unable to help, and I kind of love how over the top the guards went with the chains. He is just covered in chains and is tied up in this horrifying, almost crucifixion-esque pose. And I like that he's just given up and the gargoyles are questioning why he's not going to help. And there's a line where I think it's Laverne says, "Those chains aren't what's holding you back." And you look at this and you think, no, those chains are very much holding him back.
I mean, you say it's overkill and the chains are holding him back. He does break out of them pretty damn quickly. He doesn't have to think his way out like Basil does when he's in the death trap Ratigan's created. He's just really bloody strong.
I think the issue is they didn't put much thought into the chains. They just threw them over him thinking it would hold him back. Whereas, one well-placed chain around his ankle probably would have done the job.
Yeah, if anything, that's what I'd criticise the guards in this film for. Not the horrible acts they carry out in the progress of genocide.
But as you say, Quasimodo does manage to escape. He grabs a rope and he swings down to the square to save Esmeralda. This shot is wonderful. Again, this is one of those things they can only do with computer imagery, and it gives you just that wonderful cinematic quality of Quasimodo's movement throughout this scene. One thing I really enjoy is, if you haven't watched this film recently, give it a watch. And whenever there is a large crowd, the way they did this was with 3D models. And obviously this is 1996, early 3D models. Not great. They look all right, but if you just focus on the individual members of a crowd, it's quite funny seeing the early 3D work of these very basic models just moving backwards and forwards, and they're often repeated ad nauseum throughout the crowd. It's just quite charming.
As you say, Quasimodo swings down through the flames, grabs Esmeralda, climbs back atop Notre Dame, holds her aloft and screams, "Sanctuary." Frollo, he's had enough. He's arguably had enough several years ago, but he orders his guards to attack Notre Dame, and Quasimodo and the gargoyles are throwing all sorts of stuff over the edge to slow them down. Phoebus leads a breakout of the Romanis, and they start fighting the guards, and Frollo forces his way in. The guards are stuck outside. He runs up the tower, locks the Archdeacon out, and runs up to where Quasimodo is.
Quasimodo, meanwhile, after his victory on seemingly destroying the square below and presumably killing many, many guards, goes to tend to Esmeralda, where he sees that she is seemingly dead. And this is where the story deviates quite a lot from the original source material, which I don't have a problem with. Again, the ending of The Little Mermaid is very, very different in the original fairy tale, but for some reason this is the Disney film that people are like, oh, they gave it a happy ending. What's up with that?
I mean, I won't spoil the original ending, but if you read that book and go, yeah, I think this should be in a children's film, there's something wrong with you.
But the strange thing is I actually prefer this ending. So whilst mourning Esmeralda, Frollo comes to Quasimodo and is basically blaming it on him and that this is what had to happen. And as this is happening, Frollo is planning on stabbing Quasimodo. Quasimodo sees the shadow of the knife and manages to overpower Frollo, and they begin a brawl which extends outside, at which point Quasimodo realizes Esmeralda is still alive, so he grabs her and flees outside and begins a chase where Frollo is determined to kill them both. And it's this where we get our classic villain end, because it's in his desperation and his anger and wanting to kill these two characters that he puts himself into the fatal situation. He reveals to Quasimodo that he should have killed him 20 years ago, like he did his mother.
Like he accidentally killed his mother. Accidentally.
And throws his cape over Quasimodo to drag him down and off the edge of the cathedral. But of course, in doing so, Quasimodo grabs onto the ledge, saving himself, but he's also holding on to the cloak that Frollo was holding. So again, he's trying to save Frollo because he's not just going to drop him and let him die. But Frollo, not wanting to take that risk, sees his opportunity, swings onto a nearby gargoyle.
Yeah, so he swings over to an adjacent gargoyle, Quasimodo and Esmeralda hanging on for dear life. And by this point, the fire that's broken out underneath them is a raging inferno, and Frollo raises his sword and says, "And he shall smite the wicked and plunge them into the fiery pit," which of course is exactly what happens. The gargoyle gives way. Frollo once again experiences the imagery of the church turning against him, and he falls headfirst into the inferno and presumably into the hellfires below.
So I love that, as is tradition in Disney, this is a villain dying by their own hand, which is change definitely from the original source, but also the change of having Esmeralda live, I do think is a much better ending, particularly for a family film. I think in a family film, if you're dealing with a main character, they can only bring about their own demise, and I think Esmeralda does nothing wrong in this film. So for her to be killed by the actions of the men around her, I get what it's going for in the original novel, but I do not think that would be appropriate. Not just really in a family film, but also I think the narrative of films is very different to the narrative of literature, and having a main character killed by actions they have no control over, I don't think works as well.
Despite saving Esmeralda, Quasimodo does fall off the cathedral, but unlike Frollo, he has a friend to save him. Phoebus leans out and grabs him, and Phoebus, Esmeralda, and Quasimodo are reunited. I think the relationship between the three of these characters is superb, and there's a really sweet moment where Esmeralda goes to thank Phoebus and he sort of pushes Quasimodo forward and gives him the credit. Because just because Esmeralda isn't romantically interested in Quasimodo, it doesn't mean she cares about him any less. And that's kind of the point. And Quasimodo is over the moon that he's got friends and that he's accepted.
And it's at this point that the three of them emerge from the doors of Notre Dame to the people of Paris together. Wonderful moment where, as Quasimodo is leaving, we see the pupils of his eyes constrict, because just reminding us that he never leaves. He has lived his life in hiding, and whilst he had his one day out there earlier in the film, this is what he deserves and what he's been working towards, which is just the freedom to live amongst other people. And to show this, we have a very cautious crowd looking on Quasimodo, and he doesn't know how to react. These are the people who a few days earlier rejected him so horrifically. And a young girl runs up to him, touches his face, and it turns into a hug, at which point the crowd all rejoice and join in and are celebrating Quasimodo, who has saved them from being under the thumb of the horrific Frollo.
The last thing we get is a return to the framing device of Clopin, once again asking the question, who is a monster and who is a man? We get a reprise of the bells of Notre Dame, and we pan back out to these sweeping wide shots of Paris, and the film ends. So clearly this is a film Liam and I feel very strongly about, and there's definitely cases for and against it going on the list. But before we make that decision, Liam, is there anything else we need to talk about regarding The Hunchback of Notre Dame?
There is just one more thing. I think it's fairly easy this week. I think we're both going to be in agreement, but we need to decide who the sexiest character is. So, Ben, who do you think is the sexiest character in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and why is it Frollo's horse?
Well, it's the hair, obviously. I mean, it's obviously Esmeralda. Aside from the fact she's very overtly sexualised, I mean, at one point she's literally pole dancing. She's just awesome. If anything, she's too awesome, which is a weird criticism to level at a character, but yeah, I think, regardless of your sexuality, it's very likely you'll be attracted to Esmeralda in some format.
Yeah, it's pretty clearly Esmeralda. I think Esmeralda is kind of that gold standard of a character who is considered as inappropriately sexualized, and there's definitely an argument for that, but as we discussed, it's pretty integral to the story that at least one of the characters only sees her as a sexual object, and whether or not you believe that is an appropriate topic for a family film, they nail that, and they nail it in the character of Esmeralda. And luckily, after that point, we do focus more on her other aspects and her interactions with other characters. But obviously there is still the issue where we have yet another non-white Disney character who is being overtly sexualized in a way that we just haven't really seen with the white characters, with the exception of the Bimbettes, I suppose, but they're such a minor character that it's not really an issue.
Don't worry, Liam, because soon enough there'll be plenty of overly sexualized white female characters.
It's all I'm asking for. I guess we need to decide whether this film does enough to earn a spot on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. And if I'm being honest, I have a lot of problems with this film. I think there are elements that don't work as intended, and as you say, maybe were put in out of fear that it wasn't an appropriate story to tell. I do think in recent years Disney have been better at making films that aren't for a universal audience. I think Big Hero 6 was one that was marketed towards kids that were a little bit older, like really 8+, whereas at the time of The Hunchback of Notre Dame, we're in a period where Disney is still seen as it's got to be accessible for the whole family. You can take your 3-year-old to this. You shouldn't, but you can apparently. And I think this film suffers as a result of that identity crisis.
You're absolutely right. Although my experience of parents at the cinema was forever coloured by the fact that there was an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old being taken by their dad at the same time as when I went to see The Dark Knight Rises. So I don't know if parents can be trusted to make these kind of decisions. So I'll put my cards on the table. I would put this in the top 3 best looking Disney films ever. I think this is the best looking of the Renaissance films. I'd say it's the best looking of the predominantly 2D films. We do get, as you say, some 3D imagery in here, but I think the flame motif is fantastic. The colour, the lighting, the character animation, I think, is superb. I can't fault the songs or the score. I love the themes. I love these characters for the most part. I think, as we said, we've got 4 main characters who all get arcs, who all have interesting and complicated relationships with each other. They're all satisfying and entertaining to watch, but in very different ways. I don't hate the gargoyles. I don't love them, but I think they're fine. I don't think they ruin the film at all. I think this is a flawed film, but I absolutely love it. This is a film that gets a lot of emotional responses from me, probably more than any other Disney film. There's times when it's distressing, times when it's funny, times when it's just heartbreaking. A lot of times when it's heartbreaking, in fact. Times when Frollo just fills you with revulsion and anger, and also that sort of sadness of knowing there's real people like this in the world. So I suppose my question to you, Liam, is, as a film, this for me is one of the best films that is in the Disney animated classics canon. Is it an animated classic in the true sense? Because this film is fantastic if you're a teenager or an adult. This film is not a fantastic film if you're a child.
It's also fantastic if you're Trey Parker, apparently.
I think he falls into at least one of those categories.
Just to clarify this, I think he said it's his favourite film of 1996, which is why it was referenced in the episode Prehistoric Iceman, and also in the South Park movie. He just rips off Out There for Satan's Song, which is wonderful. So I actually don't think the intended audience is much of an issue in regards to what makes things an animated classic. My bigger problem with this film is I think there is a fantastic film in here, but there is extra stuff. But what's interesting is where I've had that feeling with previous films, I felt that they were missing something. I don't think this film is missing anything. I think you can do an edit that will fix my problems with this film just with the footage you have in the theatrical release. So cut down on the gargoyles. There's a point where you can just stop using them, and I think it works perfectly fine. I don't think they should be involved in the final fight scene. Maybe cut out half of Phoebus's quips. Not entirely. Some of them are fun, but there's maybe a few too many. And finally, it is, as you mentioned, that issue revolving around Quasimodo feeling something more than a platonic love for Esmeralda. I think if you just cut those 3 elements, you have a perfect film. And I don't mind that it has an intended audience of, let's say, 8-year-olds and up. I think that's perfectly fine to make it on the list. The question is whether, without making those changes, it deserves a place on the list. At least for me, that's the question. And you know what? Thinking about it, the fact that you don't have to add anything to make this a perfect film, I can just fast forward the bits I don't like. So I think this absolutely deserves a place on the list.
I'm glad you've come to that conclusion, because for me, this is definitely going on the list, no doubt. Although I'm wary to give the caveat that if you just fast forward the bits you don't like, the film can go on the list, because like that logic, if I just watch the last 5 minutes of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, it's worthy of going on the list.
Or if you just fast forward through all of The Black Cauldron. The Black Cauldron is a classic if you don't watch it.
No, you fast forward to the line, "You are the keeper of this oracular pig," and then you fast forward the rest of it.
But I think compared to some of the films which I've praised as being excellent shorts, if you remove them, the cuts you need to make, you're talking about 5 minutes of footage at most. And I think the only reason it's even close to 5 minutes is because for what I want to work, you have to cut most of a guy like you, which is unfortunate, but I don't think it's much of an ask. So yeah, for me, it's going on the list.
Well, Liam, unfortunately, I've lost the pen this week, so you're going to have to burn it on with a lighter.
Right, we're going to have to be quite careful here. Is it better for me to write it in some kind of flammable liquid and then set it on fire, or do I have to go very, very cautiously with a lighter? I can easily burn the words hunch on with my lighter, if that's acceptable to you.
No, it's not called Hunch. What if Disney next year release a film called Hunch? It's going to get very confusing.
Well, I'll be very careful, and here's hoping we don't do anything to damage the Lion King above it. And with that, the list has just about survived, adding another animated classic to its repertoire. And with that, we can close the vault for another week. But of course, those are just our opinions. As always, we want to know what you think. Do you think The Hunchback of Notre Dame deserves a place on the list? If so, do you think it deserves a place on the list with no caveats? Do you think it is a perfect film as it is? Or do you think its flaws hold it back from going anywhere near the list.
Were you traumatised seeing this when you were far too young and you can't view it through an objective lens? As always, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. We really do appreciate it. Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics can be found on Spotify, SoundCloud, and in special enhanced version on YouTube. And also we post regularly on Instagram with our thoughts and feelings on what Disney films we're watching at the time. And speaking of what Disney films we are watching, Liam, which film are we looking at next time?
Next time, Ben, we are looking at Musker and Clement's third entry to the Disney Renaissance, that of 1997's Hercules.
Considered by some to be their best film, that's not true.
It's also quite a bit of a total shift from this week's, so it'll be interesting to see what it's like revisiting it so shortly after this horrific, overbearing religious film.
So make sure you watch Hercules so you can share in the debate and join us next time for Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.